You know, these are stories about ghosts who became kings. They built these unbelievable empires of staggering wealth and, well, unimaginable violence. At their peak, they controlled entire nations, they commanded armies, they basically held the world in their grip. But here's the thing about being king. Every reign has to end. And when that throne becomes a target, the fall is really just the beginning of the story.
So that quote you just saw, that was the actual defense from a guy named Félix Mitchell, an Oakland kingpin, right before a judge sent him away for life. And in a way, that one quote is the key to this whole thing. It's this question about ambition and opportunity and what happens when that dream we're all told to chase gets twisted into something, well, something really dark.
So let's start at the beginning. Because what's wild is that the first chapter for almost every single one of these figures is pretty much identical. Before the billions, before the private jets and the public terror, there was nothing. Their stories don't kick off with power. They begin with the absolute lack of it.
I mean, look at these two. Their backstories are so similar you could almost just swap their names. On one hand, you've got El Mencho, growing up in Mexico, picking avocados, living in a house with dirt floors. And on the other, you have Griselda Blanco, raised in the slums of Medellín. For both of them, crime wasn't just another option, it was seen as the only way out.
And it's not just them. The pattern just keeps repeating itself. Pablo Escobar, son of a farmer. Félix Mitchell came up in the housing projects of Oakland. Amado Fuentes left home when he was just a kid, with maybe a 6th grade education, telling everyone he wouldn't come back until he was rich. And Khun Sa, the Opium King, he was an orphan who never even learned how to read. Yeah, these aren't exactly guys who were born with a silver spoon, right?
Okay, so from that absolute desperation, they built empires. This is the part of the story where they stop being victims of their circumstances and start becoming architects. They use this mix of, ruthless innovation, some serious business smarts, and just sheer brutality to build it all from the ground up.
80%. Just let that number sink in for a second. At the absolute height of his power, that's how much of the entire world's cocaine supply was controlled by one man, Pablo Escobar. I mean, that's a level of market control that most Fortune 500 CEOs can only fantasize about.
And then there's this number, $25 billion. That was the estimated net worth of Amado Carrillo Fuentes. But here's the thing. He didn't get there just by being the most violent guy on the block. He got there by being the smartest. He completely changed the logistics of the entire drug trade.
So how'd he do it? Well, he just thought on a totally different scale than anyone else. He wasn't messing around with small prop planes or smuggling things in cars. No, he went out and bought a whole fleet of actual Boeing 727 jets, ripped all the seats out, and industrialized the whole process. That's how he earned his legendary nickname, the Lord of the Skies.
And what's fascinating is that each of these kingpins had their own playbook. Félix Mitchell, he basically wrote the manual for modern street gangs, from branding his heroin like a corporate product to his whole distribution network. Khun Sa, on the other hand, he became a warlord, commanding a private army of 20,000 soldiers. And then you had Escobar, who perfected this terrifyingly simple strategy, plata o plomo, silver or lead. You could take his bribe, or you could take his bullet. Your choice.
But here's the thing about building a throne on fear. It's a pretty shaky place to sit. To hold on to that kind of power, you need a level of paranoia that just eats away at everything, and a capacity for violence that has absolutely no limits. And this is where the story gets really dark.
Just read that again. That was Griselda Blanco's actual reaction when she found out a botched assassination attempt had killed a toddler. To her, that wasn't some tragic accident. Nope. It was just tidying up a loose end. She's the one who pioneered the public assassination, turning places like Miami's Dadeland Mall into a shooting gallery in the middle of the day.
And the violence just spiraled out of control. It wasn't targeted anymore. When Pablo Escobar decided he wanted to get rid of one guy, just one, he had no problem with bombing a commercial airliner, killing all 107 innocent people on board. And the most gut-wrenching part? His target wasn't even on the plane. The message, though, was crystal clear. Absolutely no one was safe.
And this, right here, this shows you just how fast it can all fall apart. For Amado Fuentes, the Lord of the Skies, his whole world just collapsed in a matter of months. First, the U.S. indictments came down. Then his top protector in the government got arrested. Then federal agents nearly grabbed him at his own sister's wedding. The walls were closing in so fast, he did the one desperate thing he could think of. He decided to literally erase his own face.
So, that brings us to the endgame, the final act. For all their power, for all their money, every single reign comes to an end. And what's so wild is how these kings fell.
A lot of them in these, I don't know, almost poetically ironic ways. I mean, just look at this. The irony is just off the charts. Pablo Escobar, the guy who was a ghost for years, finally gets caught because he couldn't stop himself from making one last phone call to his son. Griselda Blanco gets taken out by a gunman on a motorcycle, the exact assassination method she made famous. Félix Mitchell, a millionaire drug lord, gets stabbed to death in prison over a $10 dispute. And Amado Fuentes, he dies on an operating table, killed by his very own attempt to disappear. And then, of course, you have Khun Sa, the one guy who breaks the mold, who died a free, rich man in his bed. It's the exception that kind of proves the rule, right?
But this, right here, might be the single most important part of this whole story. The death of the king is never, ever the end. See, you can take out the king, sure, but the kingdom? That's a whole different ballgame. In fact, things usually get way, way worse.
You know, it happens so often that criminologists actually have a name for it. And they named it after one of the guys in our story, the Félix Mitchell paradox. And the theory is pretty simple. When you remove that one central figure who's kind of organizing all the chaos, you don't get peace and quiet. You get a power vacuum. And then you get a bloodbath as dozens of smaller guys go to war to try and fill it.
And that is literally what happened in Oakland. After Mitchell was killed in prison, the whole structure he built just collapsed. The city didn't get safer. No, it turned into an absolute war zone. The murder rate shot through the roof as all his old lieutenants just tore the city apart, fighting for a piece of his old empire.
And you see this same cycle play out again and again. When Escobar died, the Medellín cartel broke apart, sure, but the cocaine never stopped flowing. It just found new bosses and new routes. See, taking out the top dog doesn't mean the organization just rolls over and dies. It's usually the starting gun for a bloody, brutal war for who gets to be the next top dog.
So it all kind of boils down to this one last question, doesn't it? We spend so much time and energy focusing on the hunt for these huge, larger-than-life figures. But if killing the king just makes the whole kingdom burn, and a new, maybe even more ruthless leader always rises up from the ashes, has the game really changed at all?